Welcome to all the diehards for the last panel of the day, but for the General Counsel panel, which I'm sure all of you will be going to because it's usually very interesting. I have been exhorted to remind you that you should fill out the program evaluations. So please be sure to do that before you leave. And so without further ado, let's get started. The first thing I'd like to do is to introduce the panel members. There we go. And let's start with Julio Avalos from Github. And I'm going to ask each panelist to just say a little bit about what they do that makes, that's relevant to this topic so that you can get a flavor of who's coming from where, because we hope to have a lively discussion about things. Julio.
Sure. And first, I wanted to thank Stanford and the organizers of the conference. It's been a great conference, and it's an honor to be invited, and to Heather in particular for organizing and for getting us together. My name's Julio Avalos. I head up legal at Github. Typically, when I speak to most lawyers or go to lawyer conferences, folks either don't know what Github is, haven't used Github. Github is its simplest source code versioning and development tool. It's the largest open source community in the world. You can go to GitHub and you can create projects, upload code, and then sort of work on it collaboratively. And to Heather's point about my inflection and kind of the perspective that I'm coming from for this particular talk, open source at GitHub is deeply ingrained into the company and the company's culture. The ethics, the politics, and the philosophy of open source is all something that is baked into how we operate on a daily basis. So the company runs like an open source project. There aren't managers, there aren't titles, there's no real hierarchy. Nobody tells you what to do, and you're not allowed to tell anybody what to do. In the same way that an open source project runs, if you have an idea at GitHub, you come up with it, you publish it somewhere internally, you make an argument for why you think that this is something that is important to the company, that's important to our community, that's important to the employees, and you make an argument for it. And we have lively discussions. Teams come together depending on whether the idea gets voted up or down. If it gets voted up, there's an organic team that sort of emerges and that works on that particular issue. As soon as it's resolved or it's shipped, that team dissolves and goes and creates other permutations of teams and other kind of collections of individuals working on code and working on their projects. So I think on this particular panel, and it's always important, the focus at GitHub is always on people, which is a little bit odd from a company that has kind of like an internal, we have a robot, he's called Hubot. I talk to Hubot on a regular basis. Hubot, we've automated almost anything, everything from deploying code to opening the front door. I can just talk to Hubot and Hubot will make it happen. Hubot will order you kombucha. Hubot will tell the office that you're going to be out or where you are. He knows your kind of the MAC address on your computer. So Hubot, I can just ask, hey, where's Tom? And Hubot knows that Tom logged onto the internet from his place, which is a privacy issue, I'm sure, that was discussed earlier. So there's a great emphasis on automation at GitHub, but we try to never lose sight of the human element. So I'm hoping to talk more about that is really, I think, where my interest lies, kind of the right role of automation, what should and can be automated, but not losing sight of the fact that open source, almost more than most branches of IP kind of law, is about people. It's about collaborative working, and that's what I'm interested in.
Thanks, Julio. Next, Suzanne Bell from Wilson, Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati.
Before I introduce myself, where can I get a Hubot?
We can build you one.
I'm a partner at Wilson Sonsini in the Technology Transactions Group, and I've been there over 25 years. One of my law school classmates from Stanford is here today. Actually, a couple of them are, but one of them was kind enough to remind me that our 25th reunion is coming up, and I wasn't really excited to hear that. I've been counseling on open source issues really since the very beginning, since I think I first read the GPL license back in, might have been 1990, 1992, long before open source became became common among enterprises, among proprietary software companies. So that counseling takes a number of forms. It takes the form of day-to-day counseling in what open source packages are being used, how they're being used, dealing with the viral issue, dealing with compliance issues. Also, open source audits. This often comes up for companies that haven't been as careful as they need to be, and now they're going through a financing or they're going through a deal with a major customer, and they need to have an audit of their open source done. So we'll work on that. It often comes up in the context of M&A. I would say it always comes up in the context of M&A. And then it also comes up in working with private companies who are basing their business on an open source model. So we work with companies on their business models under open source licenses. So my perspective on automation, I think we may not have a great debate here today, because I think the bottom line for me, there are a lot of good tools. We'll talk about that. But in the end, they are still just tools because of the uncertainties in the law around open source, both the licenses and the case law, and they need to kind of keep on top of all of that day in and day out. Counseling on open source really has to be multidisciplinary, so that there really has to be a multidisciplinary team, and tools are I'm sorry.
Okay.
Tools are tools, but they don't hold the whole answer.
Thanks, Suzanne. Next we have Daniel Berlin from Google.
Hi, so I manage open source licensing and compliance at Google, doing everything from making sure that Chrome and Android comply with all the licenses that they use, to making sure that the 3,500 open source packages Google uses are all being used right, to handling due diligence on mergers and acquisitions. So I end up setting the processes and policies in place of how Google uses open source, and the legal positions we tend to take on those things. And much like Julio said, open source is kind of part of the ethos of Google. And so I have the wonderful challenge of trying to figure out how to make sure that people are doing the right thing while still managing 38,000 engineers wanting to hack on random crap. So.
Thanks, Julio. And last but not least, Jilayne Lovejoy from OpenLogic.
Hi, I'm the corporate counsel at a company called OpenLogic, and we do services around open source software, including technical support and scanning and governance and license compliance. So we have a tool, a scanning tool and a governance tool, and we also provide services around that. So that's the sort of relevance to this panel. Or another way of putting it, Suzanne mentioned audits and some of the scenarios where customers who haven't, or clients haven't been keeping track of their open source, and I would say that's most companies from my perspective. But then, we're the company they call and they have the insert expletive moment, and they realize they haven't been tracking it, and they're in an M&A or vendors ask for an audit, and suddenly we get a frantic call. So I sort of bring that perspective as well as the tooling part of it. And I'm sorry, oh, yeah, that's right, you told me. I was also supposed to mention my involvement with SPDX, which is the Software Package Data Exchange, which is a work group under the Linux Foundation, which I'll get to tell you more about later. So.
Thanks, Jilayne. Okay, first we're going to do the world's fastest backgrounder on open source software. As for those of you who can use a refresher, we're talking about a pretty detailed topic today, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page, so I'm going to go through this quickly, and then we'll get to the more interesting part, which is the panel discussion. Open source software is it's essentially software that's licensed under a kind of license, and the quality of those kinds of licenses is that they don't have any scope restrictions. When you get a license to open source stuff, you can do whatever you want with it. No end user license, no field limitation, no commercial versus non-commercial, and so forth. And you can exercise all of the rights of copyright in that software. However, the licenses can impose certain conditions on exercise of the license, and that is why we're all sitting here at this table, because people want to make sure that they properly comply with the conditions of those licenses. The conditions range from the very simple to the very complex, and open source licenses essentially come in two categories. One is the permissive kind, and that's the easy kind to understand. They basically say, here's the code, do whatever you want with it. It's not our problem, which for lawyers means warranty disclaimer. But you can put it in a product that's licensed under different terms. And so those kinds of licenses essentially only have one type of condition, which is a notice condition. And we'll talk about that in some detail during the panel discussion. And the other category is copyleft, which some people call viral, but I respectfully suggest it's not a good idea to use that term, both because it can ruffle people's feathers and because it's actually, I think, pretty misleading. It's copyleft essentially says, if you get this code and you give binary versions of it to other people, you have to make the source code available to them. And also there are notice conditions as well. And this is sometimes also called free software as opposed to open source. And I think that, as far as compliance goes, most of us who are dealing with compliance activities spend most of our time talking about the copyleft licenses, and there are quite a number of them. The most popular, of course, is the general public license. As I said, all of the open source licenses, whether they're permissive or copyleft, require licensing notices, and the notices usually consist of reproducing the whole license. So just to get our terminology straight, there's a copyright notice, and that's literally a copyright notice, and then there's a licensing notice that tells you what license the software is available under. And to give you a flavor of why we're sitting here talking about automation, many products today have hundreds or maybe even thousands of open source components. So if you then put those together, you have a pretty significant administrative task that is a big issue for companies to deal with and is ripe for automation because a lot of it is stuff that can be done sort of mechanically and in a rules-driven way. This is the last slide, I promise, before we start the discussion. Just some thoughts about open source and the supply chain. The way open source licenses work is they're not things that get licensed to someone and then sub-licensed. It's like a grant to the world. And so particularly for the copyleft licenses, those terms have to get passed down from distributor to recipient to recipient to recipient. And because of this, there's a need for information to be passed down in the supply chain from original developers to OEMs to systems integrators and so forth. And conveying that information can be a significant administrative task. Also, each member of the supply chain is responsible if the open source license is violated. And so each member of the supply chain bears a risk for compliance. I think the business reality today, and I'm sure you'll hear the panelists echo this, is that customers who are sophisticated in the technology space more and more requires a detailed bill of materials on a product consisting of identifying the open source components that are in the product. And this is also a reason why we're talking about automation today. So now I'm going to go on to the panel discussion questions, and let's get started. Okay, first question. What is a so-called code scanner, and what do they do?
All right, so how many people have any experience at all with any kind of scanning for open source software? No, quite a few, okay. So it's pretty much what it sounds like. As many of you already know, you've got some kind of technology that scans your code. So you have this code base and maybe you're Suzanne's client, you want to know what open source software is in it. And so you run it through this scanning technology, and it compares it to some kind of database or repository to find matches on the open source software that's contained therein. And so the matches, there's a lot of different ways that scanners can match. It might have depending on the way the scanner works and the repository itself, it may match on the source code itself. It may look at file level snippets of code, the whole source match for like the whole file. It may match on licensed text or notices or pieces of licensed text or notices. It may match based on name spacing or file name or path or a hash code for the file or the code, or it may look at source essence, would it be sort of like the source code extracting out the comments. So there's all these different ways that scanners work. There's not one way, and depending on if and there's also different types of scanners. And when I say different types of scanners, there are open source scanners that you can download and use for free. HP has a license matching scanner called Fosology. There's a professor up at University of Victoria who has a similar license matching scanner called Ninka. My company also has a lightweight binary scanner called OSS Discovery that's under the AGPL. You have commercial vendors that have scanners, which we have as well, and some of our competitors. And then you have companies who sometimes are a little bit closed-lipped, but I know have their own proprietary in-house scanners that they've decided they can do it better because they have thousands and thousands of developers and have their own kind of scanner. And maybe we'll hear a little bit more about that later. But in any case, the thing to know if you're trying to figure out what you have about scanning technology is a couple things. One is that it works in different ways, and so you want to know how it works, because obviously a scanner that's scanning for license matches is going to find license information, which is fantastic because that's ultimately really what you want to know. But that information is not there in a lot of cases in a lot of files. There's some interesting research done by Aaron Williamson of the Free Software Foundation, the Software Freedom Law Center, on how many of the code that's on GitHub has or does not have license information at all. So sometimes that doesn't help. You need to match in the code as well. And then, of course, there's shortcomings of that. So your best case scenario, if you're kind of in the market or trying to decide what tools to use, is something that use a combination of tools or maybe even multiple tools. But then you also need to think about noise reduction. So open source software, if you're familiar with it, is quite incestuous. It's very common for open source projects to bundle in other open source projects or borrow code, and it becomes, quite frankly, a rat's nest to find out sort of the provenance of the code. And so, the best scanner is going to somehow balance noise reduction, meaning you get to somehow reduce the false positives or the redundant matches, because you could have one piece of code that ends up in many projects and then it's going to match in all those ways. And how do you decide which sort of the best match is, and sort of the quality of matches. And another thing to think about in terms of the technology that scanners may or may not do is some kind of network effect. So if you've been involved in audits a lot and you've developed that expertise on how to match things and how to find things using the scanner, and as much as I'm talking about automation, don't for a second think that there isn't a fair amount of human effort even after you've run your code through the scanner, because like I said, you have these multiple matches and you have code that doesn't have any information about licensing at all, and you have to somehow make a decision, and obviously you can only automate that to a certain extent. So another thing that a scanner might do is have some kind of way to remember what you decided a file was before, so then when you see it again, it'll give you that information. So it's sort of like a network effect there. Size of repository is a big thing that's marketed by vendors. I'm not so sure. There's no way that any repository is going to have all open source projects. I'm sure Julio could tell us how much new code is uploaded to GitHub on any day, there's just no way to keep up with that. So I think your quality of the matches and the way the information is contained is a really important factor in terms of scanning. But the other thing a scanner generally does is it also gives you a place to store this information, and I think we'll talk more about that part of the automation in terms of the bigger picture of governance and tracking what's being used and tracking those scans and how you've used it. Not just because once you find what you have, that's not the end of the question, right? I mean, in some cases, I think a lot of customers want to think it is because they've handed that bill of materials over and they're like, we're done now, right? And you're like, well, you haven't even begun to think about how you're using it and then what to do to comply. And then how do you track that software as it moves around your organization and the usage changes? And so partnering to the scanning part of it, and there's some tools that are strictly just a scanner, and there's other scanners that are part of a bigger product that has a workflow or governance piece where you can enter your policy and track requests and approvals and the usage models and all kinds of things around that. So I'll stop there. So it's probably a lot.
Can you explain for some people who might not know, what's the difference between a forensic match and, say, a license match?
In terms of the source code versus a license?
Yeah.
Well, so again, it goes back to that repository and how the scanner works. So, possibly your repository is based on source code, and you've created fingerprints or some kind of way to look. You've scanned already a bunch of source code, and then you have this. That's what you compare to, the code that you've run through the scanner, right? And in terms of license matches, then it's going to look for some. Usually, it's bits of licenses. I know that's how possible. It's hard to match the entire license. That's sort of a lot of times sort of more info than you need. So it'll match on certain phrases and then say, oh, we found this, and it looks like this license. It looks like the Apache 2.0 or so forth and so on. So again, if your goal is to find out what license that the software is under, not just what package it is, then it sort of sounds like, well, let's just skip the source code. Let's just go right to matching the license. But again, since there isn't always license information on every file, and you're generally kind of cutting down to the file level a lot of times to get a really accurate bill of materials, you need to look at both usually. And then there's a question of whether or not you have source code or binary to scan, which I probably should have mentioned. So it's ripe for automation. Automation is a very, very difficult task, and there's still a lot of human interaction that's involved in it.
Any other comments before we go on to the next question? Okay. What's the role of next generation players in this field?
So Jilayne alluded to what I would call the next generation. The next generation goes beyond scanning and offers some kind of additional applications on top of that. Management tools, analysis, workflow, an important one, automatic generation of a bill of materials. These advanced tools may be able to take your policies that you apply within your company and sort of automate the application of those policies to code that's being used.
Will you explain what you mean by a policy?
A policy, so a company may, for example, have a policy that says we don't use GPL3. So if an engineer went into the tool to upload information that GPL3 was going to be used, it would not be, the engineer would be told you can't use GPL3. Or for example, and this is an area where the tools are getting there in terms of sophistication, but perhaps not there yet. If there are particular configurations for GPL software that are permitted versus particular configurations that are not permitted, that would be the company decides at a company level and at a business level what it is that they're willing to do in terms of use of open source, and then presumably the tool could help you apply those policies as the engineers go to upload code or input information about what they intend to use. So we're talking a little bit about next generation, what's coming down the pike on setting default configurations again for what's acceptable, white flag, blacklist, what can be used. Workflow is a big part of it because, as we've talked about a couple times, reviewing use of open source is interdisciplinary. It involves not just the lawyers and not just the engineers, although those are necessary. You need the lawyers, you need the engineers, but you also need the patent attorneys, because how open source is used can affect what a company can patent of its technology, and that's a whole nother discussion, I would say. But that's, you need to have, for a proprietary software company or a company that has proprietary technology and isn't one of these companies that's just based on open source, you need to have the patent attorneys involved. And then also kind of a new addition to the team is a member of security, to the extent that open source code, which it probably is being used in systems that are used to host and manipulate personally identifiable information in some way, the code that you're licensing under an open source license needs to be reviewed for security vulnerabilities. These are the kinds of things that the next generation tools can do. Integration with development tools is another one. In the real world, to get to best practices, I will be interested to hear what my panelists say about the extent to which, apart from scans, which are very common, the extent to which these advanced tools are being used. What I've found is a lot of interest from clients, but not necessarily a lot of adoption. And I think part of the reason is that the processes they've got in place are somewhat working for them. Homegrown solutions among large companies are very, very common, and more manual kinds of solution and an open source policy and workflows that say who has to review and meetings to go over what's being used and how it's being used. I do think that because of the volume of open source and the number of open source packages that we are seeing within proprietary code only continues to increase. So I do think adoption of these more automated tools is coming, and most certainly through use, these automated tools will get better. So I think it's coming, but I don't see that it's really there yet. You will never get rid of the human element again, because you need really a practical approach to use of open source. I think that the conservative and overly conservative approach just doesn't fly among our client base anyway. So you're always going to need that human being with practical judgment, who understands the industry and the trends in industry and the viewpoint of the community with respect to the particular open source issue you might be tackling. So the way we work with our clients is often just sort of be on call as open source issues come up. We're the lawyer who's on call to talk about how the open source is being used and what the issues are, and make sure that the right members of the interdisciplinary team are involved.
Thanks. Yeah, there's
a question here.
Oh, is there a question? Yeah.
This is not directly on the topic, but
That's okay.
It goes to the amount, obviously this takes an incredible amount of resources, and that's one of the reasons for using an automated tool, but are there any trends in enforcement that you see that would make the case for the investment? And are you seeing competitors using open source as a proxy or using kind of normative methods to get a competitive advantage? Because one of the issues is who's there to enforce an open source license.
I can speak to that a little. I mean, I think we're at the tip of the iceberg right now. And yes, there are people using nominative plaintiffs to do enforcement. In fact, that's a lot of what's going on. I also think you're going to see more and more suits between private companies to use, open source violations as a competitive stick, right? So far, most of the enforcement has been by essentially pro bono organizations, Software Freedom Law Center, Software Freedom Conservancy, and they work in the name of individual plaintiffs who come to them or whom they ask, right, to help them do enforcement, because the person who has standing to enforce the license is the author, because it's a conditional copyright license. And so actually the recipients don't have standing to do anything about it, weirdly enough. But there's a lot more enforcement now, both in the US and abroad, and I think it is really the tip of the iceberg. I can say that I have spent more time on litigation than I ever wanted to in my life. I'm a transactional lawyer, and these days I'm doing, a lot of dispute resolution and litigation. Yeah, a lot of it doesn't get reported because it's kind of done sub rosa, actually, just like any other kind of enforcement.
Can I add that? I think that because I hear my salespeople sort of grapple with this a lot in terms of that business justification, and I think And I always find sort of like as a lawyer, the irony of saying, well, I don't think that if your business people are looking at, well, because I've heard people say this, like, well, those lawsuits a few years ago, was quite public, and like I think Heather's totally right. It's you're not going to see that publicity around those compliance actions anymore. I've heard people in the compliance world say that, and so without that sort of public issue, it goes to the back burner, and you have executives going, well, we're not a consumer electronics company. That's who they sued a few years ago. We're not worried. Our risk profile is pretty low. We'll roll the dice. And but I think what I would say to that is, well, the reasons that Suzanne commented on, and the M&A and vendors, and if you're in the supply chain, and the supply chain comes in a lot of different forms. I found some surprisingly that the business reasons to know what's in your code are probably much more likely to kind of catch up with you if you haven't been tracking them. And there's also an engineering aspect to it, which Dan, I'm sure will talk about in terms of good engineering practice. I think I've heard some of the compliance people say that it's compliance for enforcement of the licenses, because that's what you should do. But there's also sort of a little bit of a point of pride of sort of like, it's sloppy coding if you don't know what's in there.
I think also it's a matter of resources, and so it's balancing the resources. So whether the resources put into a tool to manage kind of upfront, or whether the resource is applied for remediation because you get that request from the supply chain or the M&A. And I think for a long time, companies always knew that they'd have this issue in an M&A transaction, but the requests from customers as part of a supply chain management is, I would say, in my experience, relatively new, and is bringing some companies up short who were not really prepared for that.
Yeah, you may be willing to take the risk, but your customers might not be willing to take the risk. Well, then that's the end of the story, because they won't buy your products unless you convince them that you're not placing them at risk. I'm going to go on because I want to get through the questions, if that's okay. The next one is, what level of automation is optimal within a corporation to track open source usage and maintain compliance?
So I think at least Julio and I would, if we could wave a magic wand and make compliance issues disappear, we probably would. I'm not entirely sure about you. No offense. But the reality is, this is very hard. I work for a 30,000 engineer company. He works for a significantly less than that.
200 people.
There you go. So the processes that work for my company, which imports something like 110 new open source or third-party packages a week into our code base, is probably not the same level of automation that's needed at his company. Although you'd be surprised. So, what we found is actually the automation that's necessary for us is much more a process automation than it is particularly code scanning or anything else. At one point, as Jilayne alluded to, we did actually have a very large code scanner that we built ourselves. Being a search company, we build these kinds of things. The thing is, once you get past a certain point and you index all of the source code in the world, you realize that all of the source code appears in all of the other source code. So as she mentioned, it's very incestuous, but not just in the ways you'd imagine, not just in kind of the ways you can see. Theoretically, yes, computer languages are infinite, right? There's an infinite number of lines of Java someone can write. There's actually only a couple billion reasonable lines of Java, and once you've indexed them all, they all appear somewhere. It's not even false positives. It's that a large number of people write the same code over and over again.
Them's fighting words on the copyright issues, I think.
Look, we do not use code scanners anymore. We focus on upfront kind of policy-based automation so that, for example, my team of 6 people can manage a source base of 600 million lines of code. So the way we generally do this is something like when someone wants to add a new open source package, it gets reviewed as part of the code review process by someone on my team. We guarantee a 24-hour turnaround for telling them whether it's okay to use it for this use case, and that's that, right? And we can control it much through the kind of advanced tools that you mentioned, are beginning to see uptake, is that we've integrated these kinds of things into our build and other systems that are homegrown, so that we can restrict visibility of certain code to certain people. So Google, sorry, I should step back for a second. Google actually has a very large unified source base. And so, but we can restrict so that I know that this package is okay to use by these people over here, but not these people over here. And it takes them 5 minutes or 10 minutes to ask us what should be done. And so from our perspective, you know, large amounts of process automation is probably very helpful to almost all companies. But large amounts of tool automation is, at least in our case, has not been as helpful. Julio might have a different perspective because I think that, you know, he's probably trying to still get things under control, having just come in. And honestly, you know, in situations where you do come into as someone else's code base, or if you're outside counsel, you know, and someone says, hey, is it okay if we do this? You know, you have a very different world that you have to deal with than the one that I do. And, you know, but even for, I mean, to be perfectly honest, when we get bill of materials reports from open source, from companies that we're trying to acquire or anything else, I don't trust them.
Really?
And in fact, I think it would be malpractice, honestly, for me to just take the bill of materials and say, well, that's what they use, and, you know, hand it down to the next person on the line without.
Well, I don't trust the ones I get from my clients.
Well, yeah, but so I mean, you know, they certainly give me some idea, but usually I look at them and I say, well, they claim to use this software, but not this other software that it requires, so this can't possibly be right. And you know, my experience has been that, you know, while that automation is helpful for these companies to get a handle on what they're trying to do and get, you know, a first pass at, oh my God, you know, like we didn't think we used any open source, but it turns out we use very large amounts of open source.
No GPL. I don't know how many times I've heard that. No GPL.
I walked into this, I was at a conference with the State Department folks, and they're like, and some Defense Department folks, and I said, raise your hand if you don't think you use open source software. And I'm like, actually, your ships all use open source software. So now you've got a bigger problem because you don't think you do, and so you don't know what they're doing with it. And so, yes, you know, you do run into these companies, and the reality is, from an engineering perspective, engineers are going to do what they need to do to get a product out. And so they will, and their VPs will protect them most of the time, just to point this out. But, you know, if you make the process so onerous, and I have seen onerous processes where basically, you know, if you want to use a piece of open source, you've got to apply to a board of, you know, of open source lawyers, and it takes 3 weeks for them to respond to whether you use it. They're just going to use it anyway, and they're going to be like, yeah, we decided to use something else. And then you're going to, you know, then you need a code scanning tool to try and catch them on it before you ship this product, right? And figure out, you know, what they did wrong, where if you had kind of done something up front that made it a lot easier for them to use it in compliance with the license, and you kind of say, look, guys, I want to work with you to figure out how we can use this, but, you know, right now the way you want to use it really isn't compatible with the license. You know, you probably would have been a lot better off. But I'm actually very curious to hear, you know, kind of the transactional lawyer experience and your experience on, you know, what kind of automation you found, you know, that some of these companies really want to use.
So you want to talk about that one, and then I'll tackle the GitHub experience. So GitHub, as Dan said, is in a different position than Google, obviously. And the emphasis that we've been putting on open source automation has been on the front end as opposed to sort of the back end scanning tools that you've been thinking about. And the other part, so that could be creating automatic tools that before you commit code are scanning that code, or at least have some kind of field or some sort of signal to the engineer that that's an issue and that it's something that they need to be thinking about. Stepping back, though, and I think that, again, this is coming from more of a startup mentality that may not be realistic depending on the kind of company that you work at or the size and scale that you're operating at. But for me and from my perspective, I can't emphasize enough the need for in-house counsel to understand culturally the issues that surround the decision to include open source in a particular project. The scanning tools work and they have their place, but if you don't understand the conditions that led to a situation in which you needed a scanning tool to get a handle on the open source that is in your stack, then you have an issue. And once you start kind of peeling away at that, you see any number of different reasons why employees and engineers at a company might want to use open source. And if you all of a sudden just start dictating by fiat, you know, you're not going to be able to use this, or you have to do this, or this is going to be the process that we're going to put in place in order for legal to get its hand around it, you're going to create an antagonistic relationship between the legal department and the engineers, and then that's when you end up kind of in the situations that Dan was describing. So questions like, and it's amazing that a lot of corporate counsel don't think about this stuff, but why is the open source being used? Is it as an efficiency standpoint? Do you not have the resources to kind of rebuild the wheel? Is it a philosophical, is it a political issue that you would want to know before you start recommending that everybody go to one type of license as opposed to the MIT that everybody's been using? You want to be aware of those kinds of issues. And one of the fears and one of the, I think, necessary things that happens when you start automating things is that there's an inverse correlation between automation and knowledge of the underlying processes that the automation was put in place to take care of. That information starts getting away from you. And I think it's important to keep in mind the situation culturally within your company that engendered the need for that form of automation. If you're not yet there, then I think that it's incredibly important to get ahead of that by having conversations with your engineers about the open source licenses and the open source work that they've been using. It establishes, if nothing else, I think a really kind of strong rapport between legal and product side of things, that you're thinking about these issues, that you're aware of those issues, that it isn't an antagonistic relationship where they need to start hiding things from you, and really embedding yourself within the development flow in that way. And that's a luxury, obviously, that I have that maybe you can't when you have 30,000 plus engineers. Yeah.
Good question. Do you generally draw that the different rules for using tools versus what's going to go in the code?
I think that's one clear place where you can draw those lines. I think at a company like, at GitHub, it's anarchy. Literally, right? It's entrepreneurial anarchy is the way that the company works, and it's sometimes unclear as to what is going to end up in kind of the consumer-facing stack as opposed to tools that you're using internally. But I think that is one place sort of that you can start developing processes from that then can be applied to everything. And I think that it's another, so that question as to the user facing, and it starts leading into kind of more philosophical questions that we have at GitHub all the time, which is what counts as a tool that's purely internal versus something that will someday be user facing and that someday will be part of the stack. So those are questions that you should be asking, and those are questions that are fun to have, frankly. And there's no clear-cut answer on that. Yeah.
I'm going to go on to the next question. I think you've begun to speak to this already, Julio, but what is the optimum? So we're facing outward a little more and thinking a little less about sort of compliance for company and managing risk and so forth. But what is the optimum level of automation in the technology industry for open source, and what are the community interests in that automation?
So on the optimal level, I think it's hard to draw that line. From my perspective, I think that automation in any industry should aim for an equilibrium between control, meaning that you still have an ability to kind of control the output and what's going on in the automated system, knowledge about what's happening underneath, and efficiency. The whole point of automation is efficiency, and that's a long answer to say that you should be optimizing for freedom, freedom of choice, freedom to kind of move on to other projects. So what the right level of automation should be, I think, is a hard line to draw. From a community perspective, and to what Jilayne alluded to earlier, we're seeing a lot, certainly in the first half of this year. There's been some press on it stemming from that study, that the community at GitHub simply, a lot of times, aren't putting licenses on their work. So what does that mean? One potential conclusion from that, and that I think that is sexy and that people have been writing about, is that we've entered some kind of a post-copyright, post-open source world where we're making kind of political decisions to not include licenses on the code that we upload to GitHub because somehow I want to either opt out of the system and I don't want to participate in the regime, get another IP regime, or I want it to be as open as possible, and therefore I'm not going to put a license on my code, which is, of course, it's exactly the opposite. What I do think that those studies underscore is a need for automation. I mean, if we can even call it automation, a need for automation at that front end. And this is sort of a theme, I think, from me and Dan, is the need to get ahead of these problems and making sure that the community is making informed decisions as to the licensing that is going on its code. The open source community so far, I think, has done a really poor job when it comes to educating users, educating up-and-coming developers as to what licenses mean. It's very balkanized. There's a camp, that camp can't talk to that camp. Oh no, we can't use this, we can't use that. And it's very political, and because it's political, nothing really gets done in terms of educating kind of the community on best practices. So I think that there's a real need, and at GitHub we're working on, I think, some hopefully exciting things that will help to automate license selection, even, is something that, both from a community perspective and from internally within your employee workforce, how are you posing those decisions to the engineers as to the licenses that best fit the particular work that they're working on, the interrelationship between those licenses, the intercompatibility between those licenses? How do we automate those procedures and those decision-making moments in time? I think that that's maybe kind of the next step where we need to go, which is educating folks on the licenses, and to the extent that we can, automating those procedures.
Thanks. I'm going to go on to the next one. What is SPDX and what problems does it address?
So how many people have ever even heard of SPDX in this room?
Other than just a while ago.
All right, so now I know where to begin. Okay, so as I mentioned earlier, SPDX is short for the Software Package Data Exchange. And I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the Linux Foundation, hopefully. So Linux Foundation has various work groups working on aspects around Linux and around open source. And so SPDX started the genesis of it was a few people who came together and said, we're seeing this issue that Heather talked about in the supply chain, where companies are asking for bill of materials for software from their vendors, upstream and downstream. And there's all this, and so there's all this information about what's in that software, including open source, but also other types of software, not just open source. And everybody, and then they're holding it in close, and then so there's all this work being done redundantly by each company along the chain, and along the same lines, the different companies are asking for that information in different formats. So it's just a massive amount of redundant work and inefficiency, and a few key people sort of said, well, gee, wouldn't it be great if we just had we started with a standard way to report the copyright and license and package and provenance information around software to create a standard format for a bill of materials. So that is, in its essence, what SPDX is. It sounds like, I feel like you can sum that up in about one or two sentences, and it sounds incredibly simple and sort of almost minimalistic. It's incredibly complicated, as it turns out, because there's a lot of components that goes into that. But the other thing is it's a launching pad for a lot of other things that I think will come as time goes on. So let me go back to the project itself. So it started really getting going a few years ago. There are 3 sort of sub-teams under the bigger work group. There's a legal team that I lead. There is a tech team that works on the specification or the standard itself, and there's a business team that's working on adoption and sort of spreading the gospel, if you will. And all of that work is done by basically, I'd say, a collaborative sort of volunteer effort. I mean, I'm fortunate enough to work for OpenLogic that's been involved in the beginning and believes in supporting this project. I mean, we obviously have a sort of a good reason to. And so that's something that my company felt worthwhile, and obviously other companies have a vested interest. But it's sort of a little bit a volunteer or collaborative effort, which I think is really cool. I mean, I end up working with our direct competitor on this project and see other like scenarios. That being said, it's on the backs of sort of and at the mercy of other your real job, day job things. So that's a call out for people to get involved, spdx.org. So it works basically like a meritocratic process, and like an open source project, really, the more involved you are, the more you have room to kind of help direct it. So it started a few years ago. Roughly, we released the first specification almost 2 years ago at LinuxCon. There's usually a lot of face-to-face meetings around SPDX at it's been usually 2 of the Linux Foundation events per year, and so we've got 1.1 out, working on 1.2, and a lot of anticipation around the 2.0 spec, which will involve some big changes. So let me go back to sort of more about what it is. So the idea of reducing that redundant work, like I mentioned, and increasing that efficiency, and having this standard way to report this information that everybody is either already asking for or beginning to ask for, as you can imagine, would also really facilitate compliance. Heather mentioned that you've got notices as a main, and attribution notices as a main, and providing a copy of the license as a key, rather administrative task. And so if you have that information already listed, how much easier will that be? The SPDX files, the sort of vision would be that along the supply chain, if you're buying this chip or whatever it is from vendor A, that it comes with this SPDX file, that could then follow it through the supply chain, thus reducing that, like I mentioned before, redundant work. The other end of it is to hopefully get the community projects to produce SPDX files, so that when you download that code, boom, all that information is there, and you don't have to keep redoing that work on that end too. So there's the sort of the corporate side and the community side, and so we're trying to work to get there's some stuff brewing to get some of the bigger projects on board with that, I think, which will hopefully spur a little more adoption in the community. One of the pieces of it that I'm going to talk about, because it's the piece that's near and dear to my heart on the legal team, and this is a legal conference, is a license list, the SPDX license list. So what we determined early on was, if you're going to have this document or this file, that you produce, that lists all the different software components at the package and down to the file level, and what is the copyright notice, and what is the license information, and sort of where did it come from, and some kind of a checksum or hash code to identify it. Then it would be really nice if you didn't have to keep repeating the text of licenses, which can be quite long in some cases. And it'd also be really critical to be able to refer to those licenses in some shorthand way, and be able to trust that when I say it's under the BSD 3 clause, that it is the same thing that Daniel means when he says BSD 3 clause, as opposed to just saying it's under the BSD license, which could mean any one of 3 different ones, not even counting the various sort of vanity variations. So we have this, what's called the SPDX license list, which has about 200 licenses on it right now. It has short identifiers. There's a sort of canonical URL with the license text. We're working on matching guidelines for tool makers to make sure we're all sort of following the same guidelines to say, well, when I see this, this is what I call it, and that we really can be. So it sounds, again, like a really simple thing. It's a ton of work, but I point this out because the adoption of the SPDX specification standard is sort of just starting to get going. I think if you start paying attention to this now that you've heard of it today, yay, and go to spdx.org and learn a little more about it, you'll start hearing, I think over the next year or so, you'll start hearing more companies coming out publicly adopting it. I think right now there's a lot of use and playing around in the background, and there's some companies that have come out, but it's sort of brewing. But the license list we've sort of found out is something I call it the gateway drug to SPDX full adoption, because it's sort of an easy place to start. So even if you're a small company and you just have manual tracking, you're actually on top of it, you've got a policy, you don't necessarily have a need for a tool like our company offers, because you only have a few developers. I mean, the typical sort of startup scenario. It'd be really easy to use the SPDX license list to refer to the licenses, as just one more shorthand way to make that process simpler.
So I'm going to, if I may, sum that up by saying, those horrible Excel spreadsheets you get from that purport to be open source disclosures. This is the way to make that a lot better. I'm going to open it up to audience questions now, since we've only got a few minutes left. Please let me know if you have questions. It doesn't have to be just about automation, open source, whatever. Yes.
I'll ask another question. You guys talked a little bit about open source and patents, and I'm kind of curious to see what the thinking is. I know Google's done a pledge to protect an open source project, and I think the rule of thumb had been not to file patents when, likely to be an open source project, but maybe the thinking should be opposite in order to defend the open source project. So just wondering, maybe the companies up there, what the thinking is.
So we generally will file patents and then open source them with the understanding that they are mostly being used to defend the open source project. Mainly because we get sued enough that we realize that if we don't, somebody else will, and we are unlikely to be able to invalidate it. But it's a very difficult problem in the open source community because of the ethos of the open source community, which is generally very anti-software patent. And so they actually take great offense in general at people filing patents on almost anything.
Will you talk about the Twitter pledge?
So Twitter also has a defensive patent pledge, which basically, if I remember the details correctly, says something like they will not use patents they will not offensively file patent lawsuits without the permission of the employee who filed the patent. In Twitter's case, as much as I love AMAC, it turns out that most of their interesting patents happen to be owned by the founder and co-founder, but it is an interesting idea. So, I mean, the problem with that is that, so we've looked into doing things like this, and it's very hard to come up with legal wording that we believe covers the cases that we would need to actually defend some pieces of open source or other projects. Plus, these pledges don't cover the case where what seems to happen with sad regularity, where a computer scientist goes off on a boat and gets lost or dies, and their estate ends up with patents. And so now you need the permission of an estate who's much more willing to sell it to a patent troll than they are to let Twitter use it to defend. But in general, I mean, the idea is actually quite nice from our perspective.
An informal policy perhaps might be
Yes.
more workable for a company like Google than a
Yes.
pledge. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, from GitHub's perspective, it's a topic that is only really beginning to be discussed within the company. Before I joined GitHub, it's funny, I had a conversation recently with someone that was brought in, a patent lawyer that came in to talk about, filing patents. And he said it was the most antagonistic, the most aggressive meeting that he's ever had. I mean, he was literally booed. He didn't get to finish. They threw him out. And he said he'd never had a reception like that. And so that gives you a little bit of a flavor for it. And I think that that's probably true at a lot of developer-heavy companies, and certainly open-source-heavy companies, that they'd rather opt out of the entire regime, and we don't want to be participating in this thing at all, in which case, the promise to be a good citizen with your patents is one way to go, and you could maybe sell that. Another thing to sort of be, and we were talking about this just before coming in here, it's important to be cognizant, though, that as legal at a company like that there's a fine line between, as I said, a conscientious objector that's objecting to something on moral grounds and sort of standing in a corner with your fingers in your ears. The reality is that the patent regime is what the patent regime is. And figuring out creative solutions that fit your particular company to make that work with the culture and to work with the code that you're writing takes a little bit of finesse. I haven't entirely figured out what the right answer is on that one.
Well, don't you kind of, it's sort of agreeing to unilaterally disarm them? It feels like if you're the only one doing it, like you feel you're doing the right thing, but then you sort of realize, okay, now anybody can come after me.
So that's right. I think that there are some solutions. If your only issue is defensive, like I don't want to get sued, but I also don't want to be filing patents. You can imagine a world in which companies like Google are coming up with some kind of technology, and then blogging about it. Like, look at this thing that we just came up with. And then you have like some form of a prior art thing that you can point to a few years from now that shows that you actually came up with it and that it predates that other technology. The downside to something like that is pretty obvious. Then you're sort of telling the world of trolls that you came up with this, and then they'll sue you. It's tricky. I mean, it's one of those things. Patent reform is one of those things that you start thinking about it, and it just gives you a headache. So I don't think about it.
All right, well, thanks for your kind attention. Don't forget to fill out your evaluation forms. And do plan on attending the General Counsel session, which is always very interesting. I want to thank all the panelists for this great and incredibly informed discussion. And also thank you for attending. Thank you very much.